Hi, y'all. I think it's recording. I hope so. Um, okay. It's definitely recording. So let me, well, first and foremost, so for this week, I kind of changed up what you'll be reviewing and what you'll be doing this week. You will still have to do the essay as is found in your syllabus schedule. That essay if you want more information on that essay, it can be found in the description of the assignment. Um, Due to the system of Proctorio, the whole thing, um, I had to split it up into like a quiz as well. So it's slightly frustrating on my end. But when you're doing that essay, um, just as much as you can outline um, what you're going to write about for that essay, and then bring that information in when you work on it and then submit it um, when you take that quiz, if that makes sense. So, which I have the rubric already available for you to read through. I have the information on the essay already available for you to read through. So it's essentially just an exam essay. Um, Meant to be 2 pages. You're kind of going through the major theories within sociology, as well as understanding which one of those theories is micro, meso, macro. So I'm also introducing you to those terms, which I'll get into with this lecture. So this lecture will be very helpful for your essay, in other words. But I'll get into it. So I'm going to share my screen. There it is. All right, so we are talking about the values. If it loads. Oh, that looks very weird. Okay, awesome. Super cool that it's not showing up. Um, you reload the screen. There we go. So, I'm discussing the values and theoretical perspectives within sociology. I'm also gonna briefly talk about contemporary theorists here, but getting into it. So, this is the agenda. So, values of sociology. Uh, then, as well, I discuss the 3 sociological practices of basic, applied, and public sociology, define those terms, discuss some crucial theorists that are more contemporary to the field, as well as the major 3 theoretical perspectives. So, you already know your Canon 3 sociologists because I introduced that first in the first video for this course. Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and Karl Marx. So sociologists ought to keep what they consider good or desirable out of research, according to Weber. A lot of this is kind of what Weber is touching on here is objectivity, the aspect of objectivity, and trying to minimize biases as much as you can when you conduct research. Um, so, objectivity is not imposing personal biases, values, attitudes when conducting research or analyzing research findings. Replication is an aspect of research not just found in sociology, but across major sciences. It's the aspect of being able to repeat a study over and over and over again. When you conduct research, you want to replicate it. Um, that makes it verifiable. in other words. Verstehen is Weber, because Weber is German. Weber developed this term. It essentially translates to grasp by insight. Here, Weber is stressing that the best interpreter of of behavior here and of human behavior is someone who has been there. In other words, an insider, who has been there and experienced that specific thing. So he's not only highlighting, interestingly enough, he's not only highlighting objectivity here and removing the aspect of biases, but he's also highlighting subjectivity and how important it is to understand how people interpret their physical surroundings and their environment, because that helps us as sociologists to understand other people and how they feel and what they experience, as well as how they just view the world around them and what's happening to them. So I have some examples here. I did so for one of my theses that I did during my undergrad time at K-State, I conducted research for a nonprofit for incarcerated women. Part of that research was not only looking at objective aspects of how the our current criminal justice system treats incarcerated women and what programs look like for them, but it was the subjective aspect of hearing from previously incarcerated women and what they had gone through. And so it was balancing between understanding what the criminal justice system looks like today, as well as getting that firsthand knowledge, that subjective knowledge from a person who's been there and experienced stuff. I hope that makes sense. So, to practice Verstehen, you have to understand other people's lived experiences and perspectives. So, in other words, you might question, how might your own subjectivity impact how you view other people? And could you yourself be biased in your own interpretations of something? And then remembering social demographics as well as being a part of this. Stated differently, highlighting and noting race, age, gender, disabilities, the list goes on here on what social demographics look like, and how that as well impacts an individual in their environment. So, for example, I use this example for my classes, but imagine you are at a coffee shop and there's a huge line in front of you, and you're in that line, you're waiting to order coffee and maybe, I don't know, a donut. And so you're waiting there for a long, long time, and you're getting really impatient, and it's taking forever. The barista seems to not maybe know what they're doing, right? And so you might wonder what the barista's doing, what they're going through, right? Maybe it's been a busy morning all morning. Maybe they're super stressed out. Um, Maybe something personal is going on in their life to make them slow at work, right? Or maybe they're new to the job and they're just trying to navigate learning everything. And so, again, they're super stressed out, right? And so it's looking at an individual and their environment and what they're personally experiencing in that moment and considering all the aspects of that experience, right? Considering not just one thing that that person might be going through, but a multitude of things, because human beings are complex. Social facts was developed by Durkheim, and it's also a very important term within sociology. It's one of the major terms within sociology as well as Verstehen. So, again, Weber developed Verstehen or Verstehen, either or. And for Weber, he wanted to teach sociologists how to conduct research. The same with Durkheim. And a lot of his research and writings also get at sociology as a methodology. So, Durkheim refers, Durkheim develops the term social facts, and it refers to a group's reoccurring patterns of behavior. This might be hard to understand at first, but a social fact is simply something that is observed continuously, that it becomes patterned. Again, and it's found within a group and how they conduct themselves. And so I use the example of weddings. And weddings, pretty broad, right? But you can start to find social facts within a certain wedding setting. Let's take American weddings, for example. American weddings have certain traditions that tend to be seen over and over and over and over again. Like, for example, a wedding dress. And so, when you go to a multitude of weddings, if you're wanting to conduct research on what people wear to weddings, right, you might see that more often than not, the brides wear white wedding dresses. And that thing that you're seeing continuously over and over and over again within that particular group at that particular social setting is a social fact. And it becomes a social fact where you can predict that the next wedding that you go to will have a bride who wears a white wedding dress. Now, again, there's outliers here, right? Like with anything. But it's just something to help, it's something that sociologists utilize to predict pattern behavior. So, for example, um, Durkheim researched suicide rates. And within this, I also note this study that you tend to find higher suicide rates among elderly people. That type of research, especially elderly older men, that type of research, they recorded continuously men over and over and over again committing suicide, where it became pattern behavior that almost became predictable to expect men at a certain age to maybe commit suicide. It's a very unfortunate statistic, but it's very true to understanding social facts here. And it further helps us to make predictions, but also prevent certain things, right? So, how can we further reduce certain things like suicide rates here? Something like this research really helps in that regard. So, take some time. I realize this isn't a class setting, but take some time, think about what these two terms, Verstehen and social facts, would look like together and how they would work well with each other. Just think about it, reflect upon it, take a second. We're again getting into contemporary theorists here. So, W.E.B. Du Bois is one of my favorite writers and theorists. He's he's a sociologist, yes, but he's also a historian. And so that's where he bases a lot of his writing, is just writing about history. But he is the first African American to earn a doctorate at Harvard. His most notable work is The Souls of Black Folk. It's a very great book, highly recommend reading it. But his whole work heavily critiqued the field of sociology. He kind of took it from his own perspective as a black man, and he didn't really see any perspective coming from black people on the field of sociology. And so he heavily critiqued sociology through acknowledging the implicit and explicit biases toward the treatment and the writing of Black people. And that's what he discusses in a lot of his writings. What he further developed here, I'm trying to figure out where to put myself, is the term the color line. This is a very crucial concept for W.E.B. Du Bois here. Within this, he discusses the veil, right? Um, Again, consider Durkheim because W.E.B. Du Bois is very much heavily inspired by Durkheim here. Because he's again highlighting the isolated individual, but he's taking it a step further and applying race here. How Black people might be isolated within a society or shunned in a society because of their skin color. And how there might be an invisible veil that keeps them separated from other people around them. So, he further highlights a division, which is the color line. And according to him, he says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa and America and the islands of the sea. So he's highlighting division here, as well as a lot of his writing is discrimination and understanding where discrimination comes from, and what it has historically looked like. He further develops the term double consciousness. In this, he says that there are two differing identities for a Black person. So you have the initial identity of being Black, and then you have the other identity of being American. And sometimes they coincide with each other, but sometimes they come in conflict with each other. Has a video here. It's a very good video. You kind of hear his writing because he's very poetic. He's again a great writer, one of the best within sociology. So if you're curious about him, I highly recommend watching this video and maybe picking up one of his books. Another notable theorist is Talcott Parsons, and then I'll get into Jane Addams. Talcott Parsons, I discuss him in my marriage and family class. He is most notable for researching families and child rearing practices. He essentially develops the Parsonian perspective, applying generalizing concepts to a social system. Within the concept of marriage and family here, he's essentially he essentially has this sort of format to a lot of his research. So, according to him, adults in the nuclear family being husband, wife, kids, but he's more specific here. The husband is working and the wife is stay at home and the kids are the kids. It's a family structure. Adults in the nuclear family perform gender-appropriate roles that ensure a stable society. Children learn their gender roles from their parents. And he concludes that families are factories that produce human personalities. He's essentially highlighting an aspect of socialization here, where we do learn a lot from the family that we grow up with. And that's a lot of his writing is centered around that. But again, he's an interesting theorist. Not one of my favorites, but he's again an interesting theorist. And then you have Jane Addams, who I discuss a lot in my social work class. Jane Addams was the co-founder of Hull House. Hull House was pretty much open to, during her time, it was open to immigrants, the sick, the poor, and the aged. She comes from a time where they used the terms the poor, the sick, and the aged. That's why I'm using those terms now. But she's one of the theorists here that really conducted field work and ethnographic field work. You don't need to know that term, but it's nonetheless important It's essentially meaning that she lived the life as subjects. She observed them in their everyday environments all the time. And she wrote about them. She quoted them. She interviewed them on a day-to-day basis. She had contact with them. And so she's definitely considered one of the early theorists that conducted field work within sociology, and that's why she's also crucial to the field. Her writings and research reflected what she saw on an everyday experience and life, and she wrote about that. Um, and she was getting firsthand knowledge and experience. And so she was actively practicing first to him. Other theorists weren't really doing that. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois was, but not really Talcott Parsons. So she's notable for that reason. There are three sociological practices that you need to know for this course. You have basic, applied, and public. These are also related to the fields that you can enter if you choose to major in sociology. And practice it. You have basic sociology. This is also known as pure sociology. This is the type of sociology that Karl Marx practiced. This is the type of sociology that a lot of sociological theorists practiced and did. Um, they do not have the goal of applying knowledge to a given society, views research as an opportunity for reform of a given society. Then you have applied. This is using sociology to solve problems and come up with solutions. You might find applied sociology within a range of structures like a workplace environment, where coworkers come together and combat an issue. And this issue might be as simple as what they need to do in that given week for their specific job, or it might be more complex, right? It might be a specific program that they need to develop for that specific workplace. For example, maybe they need to address parent leave in the workplace and what that exactly looks like. And they want to solve some problems of parents who work at that company and who aren't receiving pay, right? And so they want to come up with solutions to combat that issue within that workplace. Applied is a very important one, especially within a workplace environment. Then you have public. This is applying sociology to the public and public health and well-being. This is another crucial one. Sociologists within this realm might work with conservation uh, companies. They might work to develop certain solutions, right? So they might work in the political sphere, they might work in a broad mesosphere of developing specific programs to address something. They might work within the healthcare field. Um, they might, for example, be sociologists and social workers within the healthcare field, right? Developing certain things. So it's more so highlighting public health here and public issues. Uh, discuss this. So this is very crucial, but there are levels of analysis that you need to know. First and foremost, the research method is a systematic plan for gathering and analyzing observations about the world around us, right? It's that simple process. This comes in three levels for sociologists. And social work has their own different levels, right? But it is somewhat consistent across fields. That you have these same levels here. So you first have the micro level of analysis. Micro level of analysis is a very small analysis. It's essentially individual to individual interaction, if you will. It's understanding a person who you're talking to physically, right? When you're conducting this type of research, micro research, you're more than likely conducting interviews. It's very interpersonal in this way. Meso level of analysis kind of takes it a step more into groups and groups, companies, workplace environments. Um, Focus groups can be part of meso, but that's essentially getting at it's a step from individuals and working with individuals, and then into working with groups with meso. Macro is way more broad. It is global, or it can be global. But meso is when you start to enter the developing programs, policies, addressing issues on a global scale, or universal scale, right? It's very much broad in that way. So, for example, you could start your research. Let's say you are conducting research with incarcerated people, right? And you start that research and you start with micro. And so you're interviewing incarcerated people on a day-to-day basis, inmates on a day-to-day basis to get their firsthand knowledge, first-hand, on what they go through on a daily basis while in prison. Then you take it a step further into meso, where you might focus on a specific prison, and let's say you want to understand whether or not that prison is meeting the needs of those incarcerated people, um, like healthcare needs, right? And so you conduct that research, and that becomes meso. Take it a step further, you could start to develop policies that specifically address incarcerated people and their needs, especially when re-entering society, right? So there's a level here in applying micro, meso, macro within sociological research. Before I get into your theories, I think that it's important to first define what a theory is. So, a theory helps to explain differing examples, or sorry, helps to explain differing aspects of social interactions. It is meant to develop a sociological theory. Sociologists essentially have to test a proposition or a hypothesis about society and see if they're right or wrong about that particular hypothesis. So, your first theory here, and I, and this is going to be hard to understand theories, especially when you've never applied a theory before. And this is further hard because this is an online class. If we were in person, I would have you go through each theory, write out your own definition of it, and then you watch a video on it. Um, I obviously can't do that. So, what I'm hoping that you do is when you're watching this video, I define these theories, you write out your own definition, and then you watch the video that I have linked. Um, you watch a video on it that you can find online on YouTube. Um, I mean, you can search up functionalism on YouTube and it gives a brief definition, right? And compare and contrast these various definitions to further help you understand functionalism as a theory. Okay, so functionalism is how various institutions in society work together, i.e., how they function to maintain a whole social system. This is a macro-oriented approach. This is very important when you discuss your three theories. You need to also discuss in your essay whether or not they're micro, meso, or macro here. It is a macro-oriented method of analysis focusing on how given institutions or systems, for example, marriage, prevents the breakdown of social order. And I'll go through some examples, but just take some time, chew on that definition. The critiques of this theory is that it emphasizes stability a little bit too much, which makes it difficult to account for social change. It also overlooks power relations and social dynamics, like gender, class, race, ethnicity, the list goes on here. So those are some critiques. Durkheim was a functionalist. He was very much so he researched suicide as well as funeral practices. He also briefly discusses marriage as an institution and a practice found across cultures. So, for functionalists, let's take an example of marriage. Marriage keeps or maintains our society, according to functionalists, not according to me. That's important. Marriage is a function, and it has a particular function within society because it ultimately allows for you to meet someone, get married to them, and produce babies, thus continuing the population of a given society. And that's further function of that society because we need babies, because we need people to work jobs. It keeps a system running, in other words, something like marriage. Same with funeral practices, keeps a particular function running smoothly within a society, i.e., makes sure that people are properly buried and they have proper practices and the like there. Hope that makes sense for this particular theory and this example. Conflict theory. So, as you research these theorists and read more about them, you'll maybe start to notice that they're talking to each other almost. It's because they are. A lot of the times, they might even critique each other. So, conflict theorists heavily critiqued functionalists. That's where you get the critique there. Overlooks power relations and social dynamics. Conflict theorists attempt to understand social processes that result from disharmony, social discord, and conflict. They're all about conflict here. And I know that sounds like it's micro. It can be micro, but it also can be macro. It balances between making it almost meso here. But conflict theory can really be micro, meso, macro, and how you apply it, which makes it a very good theory. Conflict theory underscores how corporate elites and the organizations that they control work for their benefit and not the benefit of the society as a whole. The famous champion of this theory is Karl Marx, um, which he wrote a lot on this particular theory, as well as C. Wright Mills. Many personal troubles must be understood in terms of public issues. That's what C. Wright Mills says here. Conflict theorists want to note or highlight the imbalance here and how there might be disharmony within groups and how they conduct themselves, further highlighting how that disharmony might lead to conflict between groups. The critiques of conflict theory involves critics argue that conflict theory focuses too much on change rather than recognizing that change can be minor or incremental, very small. Conflict theory has been expanded into intersectionality theory, allowing for the recognition of the interconnected nature of social categories like race, like class, like gender, in overlapping systems of oppression. So, I know that's a lot. Again, just chew on the theory, for now. I gave the example of marriage here and how marriage can be a function within society for functionalists. Conflict theorists disagree with this notion and find that there can be issues within a marriage structure. They note and they get into, for example, a lot of conflict theorists highlight gender as an aspect of it and how there can be conflict where you have an imbalance or an unequal partnership, where a lot of the labor, especially at home, falls on women. And so that's what they might highlight here within the aspect of conflict theory. Again, they're just highlighting a power imbalance. They're highlighting power here and how power might be focused on one person and another person might be experiencing oppression because the other person holds all that power. I hope that makes sense. Symbolic interactionism is one of my favorite theories. It is a again, micro, oriented analysis that focuses on how people interact in an environment and how that interaction gives meaning in their lives. I know that's a lot. Stated differently, interactionists attempt to understand the ongoing processes of attaching meaning to symbols, behaviors, and attitudes. And these symbols, behaviors, and attitudes help to shape people, their identities, and social worlds. Symbolic interactionism kind of gets at how we interact with our environment on a more symbolic scale, where we don't even recognize the things that we are doing. So, functionalists, again, let's go back to the example of marriage. Functionalists, again, highlight marriage as a function within society. Without marriage, there wouldn't be a influx of babies being produced and there wouldn't be any workers, right? They come to that conclusion. Conflict theorists highlight the conflicts within marriage, how there might be issues, how, for example, conflict theorists might even argue that, yeah, but not everyone is able to get married. What about people of particular groups throughout history, like interracial marriage, like LGBTQ plus people who want to get married, right? They might highlight that aspect, that marriage isn't always equal. For symbolic interactionism, they more so want to look at the practice of marriage. What goes on during, for example, a ceremony? What might be being used in that sort of practice? What is the bride wearing? What is the groom wearing? What are they doing? Do they have religious associations where they do something during that marriage ceremony that represents their identity to some capacity, right? It gets more specific there on what these people are doing in these social settings. And again, it's highlighting symbols. So, moving beyond marriage here, I'm trying to look for symbols around me. Should have grabbed something. Hold on. Okay. I, for some reason, cannot find any symbols, I found a symbol. Okay. So, apple. That is a symbol. When you look at the symbol, you know what it's referencing. It's referencing the brand Apple. You also know by looking at it Maybe who owns that company, right? Or produces that particular technology. Maybe you yourself own Apple products, right? That symbol invokes something. Another example here is a cross. A cross is a symbol. When you look at it, you might feel tied to it, or not tied to it at all, right? But you might feel tied to it in a particular way. You might practice Christianity, and therefore looking at a cross might make you feel something. Again, it's how people interact with certain symbols and then conduct themselves a specific way in an environment. And they furthermore might have attitudes towards those symbols, right? And so for one person, when they see a cross, they might feel tied to that cross. Other people, they might see a cross and find it that they don't really like looking at that, right? Again, some examples. Some critiques here. Symbolic interactionism has been critiqued for being overly subjective. It does not offer a macro-oriented perspective. It also fails to account for systemic and institutional issues. Now, for me, I feel like these critiques more so highlight the benefits of the theory and how you apply it, rather than the negatives, if you will. But again, some sociologists might disagree with me. So, I guess, final slide. I'll just apply another example here if you're still struggling with these theories, right? I also want to note before I apply this example, when I'm explaining what functionalism is and what functionalists consider the theory is, um, and conflict theory and the like, that doesn't mean that me myself feels this way. I am talking about a particular theory and how theorists apply it. I hope that also makes sense. So we'll just talk about and apply each of these theorists to sports, physical activity, and fitness. We'll do that example. So I would ask you, but obviously I can't do that. So for functionalism, they would view sports as sort of helping the body function in its full capacity. Does that make sense? And it also views health, fitness, and the like here like a culmination of different things that help the body function a particular way. Again, function is a very important term here. And so, in order to be healthy, you might not just need to exercise, you also need to eat well. You need to do certain things. Maybe you need to take supplements. The list goes on here, right? On living a healthy life. Maybe you need to go to therapy, talk about stuff, right? And so it's stuff like that that helps the body function a particular way rather than breaking down. I hope that makes sense. Conflict theorists would take sports and the like here and view it through a conflict lens. They would say that, for example, a conflict theorist might um, discuss unequal pay among female athletes and male athletes. They might highlight this, or they might discuss historical discrimination of black people and the like in particular sports. They might discuss the fact that they might question why women can't play football, right? They might question these things because it's part of what they want to discuss here. It's part of inequality here and what they want to highlight with their arguments. Symbolic interactionism would, for symbolic interactionists, they would go to sports games. They would um, look around them, look at the different symbols, right? They might look at mascots and what those mascots represent. They might look at the history of a particular sport and what it represents, the symbolic meaning of particular sports. How, for example, Football has commonly been tied to American culture. They might look at that symbolic and cultural meaning of what football means to Americans. It's just some examples here. Okay, I gonna go back to my main screen. Stop share. Okay, so that's the basic theories, three theories. Um, all right. I'll be discussing socialization in the next lecture video, so goodbye for now.